All right, hi everybody. So my name is Victoria Levy, and I am a senior FinOps engineer at Alteryx, leading our FinOps team. And today I would like to go into a topic that is really important to the FinOps community, which is shifting left. And so there's a lot that goes into that because you can't just rush into it right away. And so governance is a really big part of that. So today I'd like to walk through my path to how Alteryx was working on shifting left by building up governance in our FinOps program. All right, but first, a little bit of background on myself. So I've been in the FinOps space for about 5 years now, and I've been at Alteryx for almost 3 years running our FinOps team. And over the past year, we've been working on shifting left through trial and error. And so what I've learned about what works and what doesn't work has caused me to recontextualize FinOps and how it fits within the overall organization. So before I get into what that means, I have a few scenarios that I want to go through. And so let's go to the first one. So, all right, so this one is generally a common FinOps problem that happens. And let's say that the FinOps team gets an alert on a Friday night that your cost for GPU usage, because people are trying out some cool new AI stuff, it's jumped up to $50K a day, right? But it's after business hours. So if you don't do anything, by the time someone looks at it on Monday, that could be almost 200K. So you as the FinOps team, what would you do in this scenario? So I'll give you a second. All right. So you probably have an answer, and I bet everybody's answer is slightly different depending on what your organization has chosen to do for these issues. But I have a second example. So this one was the easy question. The next one is a bit more difficult, or at least I've tried to make it that way, so you can let me know afterwards how well I did with that. So, all right, so in this case, let's say that we have a Linux kernel bug that is affecting only current Kubernetes versions for some reason. And a patch hasn't been released yet for all versions. And so leadership is deciding between, do they downgrade or do they just wait for that patch to become available? Now the engineers, they would rather downgrade so they can resolve that vulnerability. It'll be easy to fix that and then move on with their work. But those previous versions require more nodes, they're less optimized, and they even fall under extended support. So those are additional charges. So FinOps has been looped in to help advise in that scenario. So for this one, as the FinOps team, what would you do in this case? So, all right, so this one is definitely more complicated, and I made it that way on purpose, hopefully, to try to convey that it's the engineers who should be thinking about FinOps in their day-to-day decisions, where FinOps isn't always going to be there to advise them. But hopefully the FinOps team can at least enable them to start thinking about these considerations as they go through their day-to-day. Okay, so for both of these, I don't have an actual answer to give you because there is no real answer, there's no right answer, everyone's gonna have something different. So for these, if you haven't guessed already, my first suggestion would be to start with governance. So, all right, but let's define some terms first. So in this case, shifting left has to do with making sure those cost-aware product decisions are closer to the engineers where the resources are actually deployed and those costs are going to actually be incurred. But there's a lot of stuff that goes into that, and so it causes some challenges for the teams. So first, if you have too little support for the FinOps team, then as they try to achieve those FinOps goals, they might accidentally recreate FinOps themselves, which would just be duplicating work. But now if you give them too much support, so that might be too much information, so they might feel overwhelmed and not know where to start, especially if some of that information is not actionable for them. And then of course, if you don't have support from leadership, then they're not going to know how to prioritize those cost optimizations alongside all of their other priorities that they have to work on throughout the year. And so governance is meant to drive that actionable planning. And so when we shift left, we don't want to just throw things over the fence to the engineers. We want to bring them along in our journey as we implement our FinOps strategy. So at Alteryx, I started implementing a couple of things to help address this. So we have our policies, processes, and enforcement. So policies are there to help engineers know what is expected of them, what outcomes do we want from them thinking about FinOps. And then processes are how they are going to achieve that. And so that could be the FinOps team telling them what things they need to do, or it can come from the engineering teams themselves, as long as it is something that is documented and repeatable. And then lastly is enforcement. And this is where the FinOps team can come in to add value by monitoring compliance with policy, assisting throughout that whole process, and then ultimately holding the teams accountable. So let's walk through how I got to that point. All right, so last year I gave a talk about using data science and analytics to help with our anomaly detection and forecasting. And so I closely worked with our data science team to build out our pipelines and model our cloud costs. And this cross-functional partnership really did open up some new capabilities for the FinOps team as well as the other team that just didn't exist before. So with that better anomaly detection, I needed a way to get engineers to start taking action on those new alerts that we were sharing out with them. And so I was talking with my husband about this, and he is a staff security engineer, and he was mentioning how a lot of what this is similar to what security teams already do today for incident and vulnerability management, especially if they've shifted that part left. And so he suggested I should talk to the security team, and so I worked with them to collaborate on some things. And so one of the things that they were open to was combining their vulnerabilities with the actual cost impact of taking action there, so that we could bring the full picture to engineering teams about the impact of them actually resolving some of these. And so there's a lot of other things that security and FinOps can work on together. Next, because I sit in IT, governance is always top of mind, so governance of the cloud in general. And so I was looking for a way to provide a more formal structure to the FinOps program itself. And so I asked for a mentor on our GRC team, which stands for Governance, Risk, and Compliance. And my mentor, she introduced me to the NIST documentation, which is what our security team uses in part for their security governance. And so NIST stands for the National Institute for Standards and Technology, and they've been developing their guidance for decades. And so I thought that I could take some of their best practices and then just use them for FinOps instead of trying to create something brand new from scratch. So when it comes to security, they essentially manage risk around the CIA triad. So that's confidentiality, integrity, and availability of our data and systems. But on the FinOps side, we also manage risk when it comes to our cloud finances and business value. And so both of these programs should essentially roll up into an overall enterprise risk management strategy. Now, just how security has to make trade-offs on the cost that it takes to protect the company from those risks, FinOps also has to make trade-offs, as well as engineering, on the cost of infrastructure versus the ROI or how much slack they want to have in the system and things like that. So, all right, so every company is going to have a mission and goals, but they're also going to be exposed to many different types of risk that could interfere with them achieving those goals. And so some risks are going to be common across all companies, and then other risks are very specific to one organization. So there are multiple types of risks that we can go through. So the first one here is negative risks. And so this is what we normally think about. And these are events that could have a negative impact on the business. So it could be anything from their mission or finances, reputation, products and services, things like that. Now there are actions that you could take to address these risks, and those are going to be to mitigate, transfer, avoid, or accept. So for example, let's say you are over budget. You could decide to accept that risk by going and asking for more money. But if you want to mitigate that risk instead, that's where you might do some optimizations to get your spend back in line with budget. Now we also have positive risks, and these are a bit different. These are events that are associated with opportunities that could bring the business closer to its goals. But it's the decisions that you have already made versus the decisions that you could have made instead that leads to some uncertainty there. So it's always the trade-off or the opportunity cost of where the best opportunity is going to sit. And so that's why there's some risk there. Now, ways to address positive risks are going to be to realize, share, enhance, and accept. So for example, if we wanted to realize a positive risk, that could be achieving some of the savings that are in our right-sizing recommendations. Or we could share a positive risk by sharing best practices among teams, or if you have any automation scripts that you want to send out to multiple teams, that could be another way as well. Now, many organizations already follow a risk management framework to help the organization manage all these different types of risks. And so, for example, they might document the current state versus future state and actions they need to address those. And so all of those updates get sent back to the business around the different types of risk that could fit within that whole business. And so going back to NIST, they actually recommend that you can implement different controls to bring those different risks to an acceptable level that the business can then define. And so when it comes to FinOps, we have something similar with our domains and capabilities. So those are essentially controls that we can put in place to reduce our financial risk of operating in the cloud. And so we can reframe this whole FinOps process as helping the business to mitigate the negative risks while achieving the positive risks or opportunities that are out there. All right, so these 6 steps here also come from NIST, and their enterprise risk management versus their cybersecurity risk management, but we can view all of this through a FinOps lens as we go through. Now, this is also just a suggestion to use these frameworks, so feel free to use whatever works best for your business. There are other governance frameworks out there too, such as COBIT, or the SANS Institute has one, so. But all right, let's start at the first level. So this is where we have the executives who are going to set the overall business strategy and priorities. And so from the risk perspective, they are going to set what is called a risk appetite. Now that's defined as the broad-based amount of risk that an organization is willing to take in pursuit of its mission and vision. So with that set, we then go to the next level, which is upper management. So they're responsible for taking this general risk appetite and turning it to more specific guidance, which is called risk tolerance. And so in this case, it's defined as the organization's readiness to bear any of the remaining risk after they've implemented their risk controls. And so it's up to them to kind of decide where they want those controls to address, and then whatever is left, they get to discuss with the executive to see if they can accept that. So the upper management will also define targets and metrics for that specific guidance that they want teams to follow, and they'll identify the critical assets, the priorities to assign to those assets, and then they'll work with the business level to make sure that all of these controls are implemented. So that's where we get to the next level here. So at this system level, we have practitioners who implement what are called risk treatments. So these are all the controls that I've mentioned. And from here, they will develop KPIs to monitor the effectiveness of these controls, and they'll also build reporting and anomaly detection. And so all of these steps here sound really similar to what FinOps practitioners do today, and this is part of what we want to start shifting left as well. Now, this level, from the business level, is responsible for bringing any changes in the implementation of these risk controls or just the risk environment in general, sharing that back up to the business level to make sure, or I guess to the executive level, to make sure that they can adjust and evaluate as needed to make sure everything's in line with their business strategy. Now, these updates that they send up, every business unit that's managing different types of risks can share all of that, and it gets aggregated into what is called a risk register. And so this is kind of like a list of all your identified risks for each area. And in FinOps, we can actually make something similar to that, and we kind of already do when it comes to our, for example, savings optimizations like right sizing and things like that. You could also add additional things such as new deployments from engineers or any upcoming price changes from the vendor into that risk register for FinOps. But FinOps teams don't always know everything, so when you're creating that document, as we shift left, we're going to rely on the engineering teams to share some of that information with us, so any of the risks that they've identified, that can flow back into FinOps to then evaluate and adjust as needed as well. All right, so again, referencing NIST, they define risk management as a holistic activity for the organization. And so I've taken their definition of risk management and reworked that for FinOps as well. So we can define FinOps risk management as the process of managing risk to the organization's operations that result from the usage and cost of cloud and other scopes. Now, since cloud and Cloud Plus is such a significant portion of a company's operations and expenses, it does make sense for risks that are related to that to make its way up to the executive level to address and to monitor. So when we look at risks to the organization, cybersecurity and information risks are just one segment. So enterprise risk management delegates different teams to manage the different components of risks in the organization. So just how security teams manage risk around security, they are resources dedicated to that activity. The FinOps team are also resources dedicated to managing risk around the cloud. And so that would then make FinOps teams responsible for making any decisions that are related to risk events around the cloud. They would need to implement policy and processes for all of our FinOps domains and capabilities. And then again, reporting on that and sharing that back up with executives. And so all of this is kind of what FinOps does today. We could just reframe it in a different perspective. And by doing that, by framing it from risk management, that's another way to show the business the value of running a FinOps program for the future, even after we've shifted left. All right, so you've probably heard me mention NIST a ton already, so now I would like to continue to be talking about NIST. I don't know. They have a cybersecurity framework too, so we're going to keep talking about them. And in this framework, this outlines different activities that security teams are going to work on to address cybersecurity risks. And so these activities here are identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And at the center of the circle, we have governance. And so this is an intentional design to show that governance is an activity that reinforces all of the other ones and is not just something on its own. Now, this one looks very similar to another one that we have on this slide, which is our FinOps phases. And here we have the activities of inform, optimize, and operate. And so we already do this today when we're maturing all of our capabilities in FinOps. Now, NIST recommends that their framework can be used alongside other frameworks to make something that's unique to an organization. And so we could do that too here by using it alongside our FinOps framework. So my proposal is that just how governance is at the center of every activity for cybersecurity, it is also at the center of all of the activities that we do for FinOps. So let's see how we can use these two together. All right, so here I've put the cybersecurity framework on the left, and then all of the FinOps domains and capabilities from the FinOps framework on the right. And we're gonna go through this one step at a time. So for each of these activities, my goal here is to enhance what we're doing for FinOps. So I've called this FinOps++, similar to what C++ did for C. And now since NIST's framework has been around and has been used broadly and validated on the cybersecurity side when it comes to governance, I wanted to take some of that and use the success from there to replicate on the FinOps side. So, all right. Cool, so the first one we have is governance. And we already do have something like that for FinOps, which is our managing the FinOps practice domain. And this is what the FinOps team is already responsible for handling. So under this domain, we also have our policy and governance capability. And so what I'm looking to do here is to pull that one out and make it a bigger part of what my team is doing for FinOps. All right, now we have identify. And this one matches pretty closely with our domains for understanding usage and cost, as well as quantifying business value. And when it comes to FinOps, we're already doing visibility and allocations and identifying our data sources and doing anomaly detection. So I would say that this activity is already pretty well defined on the FinOps side as well. Now, the protect function on the security side, they're gonna view protect as managing vulnerabilities and resolving those to reduce risk. And for FinOps, for us, it's going to be optimizing our cloud and usage. And so for FinOps, we want engineers to start thinking about this area of the framework so that they can start doing some of those optimizations as we go. But another thing I wanted to add was maintain, because we don't want to optimize and then have to do the same thing twice and lose out on all the hard work we did. So for example, let's say that we've spent time moving all of our volumes from GP2 to GP3. If you just do that once, then engineers could drift back into using GP2 again, and then you'll end up having to optimize the same thing twice. And so we want to prevent that. So I've tied this to policy and governance as well, so that we can build out the policy and governance, as well as automation to ensure that the best practices we've implemented get to stay there, and we can achieve that and work on something else. All right. So for this one, I've connected two of the cybersecurity framework activities because both of these can map to what we have in FinOps already for anomaly management. So here I'm trying to take anomaly management as well and make it a bigger focus, since NIST essentially has two big buckets here. And there's a lot more that we can do on the FinOps side when it comes to detecting and responding to anomalies. But again, this one ties back to policy and governance too. So in the FinOps framework, when we talk about anomaly management, we're usually thinking of cost spikes or unusual spend. But from the NIST perspective, when they view an anomaly or an incident, they're looking at things that fall under policy violations as well. And so that is something that the FinOps team needs a process for in order to detect and respond. And so, for example, let's say we have a policy in FinOps that teams need to have an instance on a schedule so that it can be shut down when it's not in use. Well, if we then go detect that a team doesn't have this, then that becomes a policy violation, and then the FinOps team can respond to it and resolve it to bring those best practices back in line. And so that's why we can also tie the detect and respond activities to our policy and governance capability. Now, this is also important, again, for cost spikes as well, because in the scenario, if we don't have a process or if we don't have our next steps defined, teams might be scrambling around in an emergency trying to figure out what to do. But if they can follow a process, a documented step of things that they need to do, those steps can be predefined to already allocate the business strategy and already be in line with everything that the business would want to do in this scenario versus what people think might be best in the moment but might not actually line up with that strategy. So that's why it ties back to governance as well. All right. Now we also have the recover step. So this is the last one here. And this is how we're going to iterate this whole process for FinOps. So during recovery, for both security and FinOps, we want to bring our systems back to normal. So for FinOps, that might mean bringing a cost spike back down to its usual usage. And so after we've recovered, we'll do something called an RCA, which stands for root cause analysis. And the results from this RCA are what get rolled back into our governance strategy. So it could be something like developing a new policy that you then want to maintain and monitor. But there's also the added benefit of bringing engineers into that RCA conversation so that they get a better perspective of the impact that their architecture decisions have on the cost of that infrastructure. So it's not just about FinOps figuring out what they could do better. It's about bringing the engineers in and helping to build that shift left culture as well. All right, so the last three activities here can actually be grouped together into what is called incident response. And when it comes to responding to events, again, we need to do so in light of the business strategy and the priorities that they've set. And this is important because if you don't have that prioritization, when multiple incidents come up, how do you know which one you want to address first? Or how do you know which ones you need to escalate to leadership to deal with versus ones that teams can just handle on their own? And so we can build upon this incident response category for our FinOps practice by repurposing some of the templates and processes that come from NIST as well. So this one is the final slide in this iteration here. So this is my vision of how to create a FinOps governance strategy for an organization, and that's what my team has been working towards. All right. So if we pull all of this together, we actually get something that looks a little bit different. So this is my reinterpretation of the NIST cybersecurity framework translated into governance pillars for FinOps, at least for my team. And so at the bottom, we have those activities that I mentioned before. And then at the top is my view of the FinOps governance pillars that we use internally. And so what I did here was I moved the operate phase to the center of that circle, again, to highlight how governance is part of every single activity that we do for FinOps. And then I also added incident response as its own activity here so that we can focus on building out the policies and processes as part of our anomaly management and build that out for FinOps. All right, so going back to NIST again, since that's the theme here, they have a publication called 853 that goes into specific security controls that teams do to reduce their risk. And similarly, in FinOps, we have all of our capabilities. But in those capabilities, we don't always have something specific around the governance of each of those. And so I've outlined a couple of things here that my team has been thinking about. And so these are just examples. These aren't like written governance things that you need to have. But one outcome that we want to achieve is to clarify some of the roles and responsibilities that we want our engineering teams to take on as we shift left. Then another one is to monitor the automation that we've put in place to make sure that everything is working as intended. And then my favorite one up here is another callback to security. So we have our cost incident response team under incident response. And this one is the FinOps CERT, which is similar to the security incident response team, which also goes by CERT, but just with an S. So, all right, so if you've already gone through that process that I mentioned before of creating a risk register and identifying all of your risks, then these outcomes here will just become apparent as the next steps that you could take to resolving those risks. And so that's the process of how you can build out some of these outcomes for your team. All right, so we have already gone through a little bit of that. So there is a FinOps assessment that we have on the, well, not we, but the FinOps Foundation has on the website right now that you can actually download as a spreadsheet and start filling out. And I thought it would be interesting to compare that to the one that NIST has, which they call their org profile, because they are really similar. So both of them, we can see in more detail, we have the current state versus future state. So you could document your goals and then identify the gaps that you have in trying to reach those goals. Now we have additional columns here. We can add other details such as policies, processes, and procedures that you're already doing. You can add any KPIs that you've developed. And you can also talk about the prioritization of all of these items. So how important is one of these capabilities to your organization, and how important is it to start maturing on that capability? So when we go back to the risk management framework, I mentioned that risk register document. So that is a second document over here that has all those identified risks. And the risk treatments that you will list as a way to reduce that risk are going to be items from this spreadsheet here. So they are both connected. So you identify the risks, figure out what you need to do to treat them, and then this one documents how you are implementing those treatments. Now, because these two are so similar in structure, you can actually take some of the line items from the NIST one and put that right into the FinOps one to make something that's custom to your organization. And so I have an example of how I kind of did that for my team so far. All right, so this is my version, and this one's a bit messy because it's just my thought process in going through it. It's not the real spreadsheet, but here in the center, I have our FinOps domains, and I have the capabilities in like a real spreadsheet somewhere, but the FinOps ones are here, and I wanted to enhance that with some of the capabilities from NIST. So in the top, I have their governance one. And so one of the ones I want to highlight here that I think is important is supply chain risk management, because believe it or not, that does have to do with FinOps. So this one was important to me because you might get price changes from vendors that you can't control, and that's going to impact your cost. And there's also a risk to being locked in when you buy RIs or if you sign up for an EDP and things like that. Now, on the incident response side, even though we have the anomaly management one in our existing FinOps capabilities, I added a couple more components from NIST here to make sure that I'm capturing that full life cycle of incident response. Now, you can use these to plan your future state and your gap analysis to help improve. But again, like I mentioned, that always has to tie back to your business priorities. And so when you're doing that gap analysis, you can't just achieve full competency on everything. You have to make trade-offs. And so the way you decide which ones to work on will again come from the business priorities and which risks we want to address. Now, for this, you can also make multiple assessments for the actual different scopes of FinOps. So you can have one for SaaS or for data center. You can do this for different teams if you wanted to track them separately. And then I would also recommend reviewing this periodically. So my team started reviewing it quarterly, but that was way too much work. So we changed it to yearly so that we could capture the major changes to our implementation state and our priorities as well. Okay. Now I also wanted to include a flow diagram of how to put a policy in place, because organizations don't always take this formal of a step to document expectations that come from different teams. But if you're trying to shift left and trying to ask engineers to take on something new, it really helps in communication if you can give them a document to read through. So when building policies, again, the FinOps team needs to do so in light of that overall business strategy, so make sure you're not contradicting anything. And if there is already a process for putting policies in place, you can kind of copy that or use any of the templates that might exist. Now, let's say a FinOps team wants to start creating a policy. Well, there's some expectations you have to set first. So first, stakeholders should be made aware that a new policy is coming, and they should have time to provide feedback. So that's the first couple of steps here. Then you should also make sure that you're clearly defining those roles and responsibilities, because as we're asking them to take on new tasks, they should know what things that we want them to do versus what are all those other FinOps things that they shouldn't have to worry about. And doing this builds trust with the team, because once the policy is understood, the stakeholders can agree to follow it. And then that trust will create buy-in that can, in the future, drive accountability. And so that's where our first decision diamond here is. So we want that stakeholder approval. And then finally, once we've gone through this process, maybe iterated it a couple of times, the FinOps team should feel comfortable enough to then start holding the teams accountable for these policies. So let's go through an example policy. So you could have a policy that says that teams who go over budget, they need to recover that variance in 30 days. So that's the policy. Now the process part could be that maybe they have to come up with their own optimizations to get there, or maybe they have to take the ones from the FinOps team and they have to do those right sizing recommendations. So that process is up to you. It could be different as long as it helps them achieve that policy outcome. But there's also another option if teams think that this policy doesn't apply to them. They might want to ask for an exception instead. And so at that point, you would then have to go through a new exception process that you might also have to create and define for the team. So this is also just an example, because there's many ways to implement policies. You probably already have your own, but just in case this is new for your FinOps program, this is one way that you could do it. And so as long as your FinOps team is thinking about putting these kinds of documents in place, it can help build that communication with the engineering teams as you try to partner with them to shift left. All right, and while we're talking about policies, I also wanted to talk about what happens when some of those are violated. So people often think about FinOps anomaly alerts as cost-related, and so I have that as our first bullet point here. So that's an incident that you would want to respond to, for sure. But there are also other types of incidents, such as policy violations. And so here, I wanted to call back to that CERT team that I mentioned, so the cost incident response team. So on the security side, the security incident response team is responsible for handling those alerts. And so you can have that capability on your FinOps team as well. It could be a person who is dedicated to dealing with incidents, or it could just be a new task that your whole team has to take on. And so once you have that in place, then you can detect when those policies are violated and then work to resolve those and go through that whole incident response process. Now, we also can have incidents around our FinOps tools and systems. So if you are a business partner to the organization and they're relying on your tools, then you need to communicate with them and be responsible for keeping those systems up and running. And when that doesn't happen, that's another type of incident that the FinOps team then needs to address. And so I've included that here as well. So there are many options when choosing a model for your incident response. So I have a couple of examples here. So Wix had a really good presentation last year about using incident response alongside their existing production incident response, so that, again, they're just borrowing from other teams, so they don't have to build something brand new. It already works for their organization, so they could just tap into that. There is also an article on the FinOps website, which is Managing Cloud Cost Anomalies, and that goes through that full life cycle of incident response as well. So, and then you can also come up with a model that works for you, because again, this is going to be unique to each organization. Cool. So I mentioned how important it is to have those roles and responsibilities defined. So here are just some examples that you could use. I didn't include anything on the engineering side because that one will probably be more specific to your organization and what you want the engineers to start doing for shifting FinOps left. But one example that I can mention is having a FinOps champion in each team. So again, this ties back to security because you could have a security champion. And so these people sit on each team and they might get additional training to help build that culture across the organization. Now, from a risk management perspective, we've already talked about a lot of these, but just to summarize, we have our risk executive who's going to set that risk appetite, the risk manager who will set the risk threshold and identify those critical assets. A risk owner would be responsible for managing threats in the system, so they might be somebody who is like the cost owner for the resources. And then a system owner is maybe the application owner, so somebody who's going to be more at that business level implementing all of those controls. And then, of course, we talked about that risk exception process. So you need someone who is going to be part of that process to either approve or reject any of these risk exceptions that you get. And then also we have the incident response side. So here, leadership is going to oversee any of the key decisions that happen if an incident does get escalated up that high. But of course, we're always going to have an incident lead who kind of project manages the incident and can delegate activities. So they can delegate somebody to be an incident handler who is going to be the person who acts during the incident. And so from here, they're going to rely on the technology professionals and the asset owners to actually implement the resolution to whatever these incidents are, because those are the ones who are going to have access to all the systems. So FinOps isn't always going to have that access, and so we need to partner with the engineers to get that resolved. So now, before you get to a place where you're taking all of these steps and following these processes, in shift left, teams are going to assume responsibility for those certain risks. And so they should already know what the FinOps team wants from them before an incident even comes up. So it's important to have that documentation for those incident types that we discussed created ahead of time. That way the teams can follow their specific role and align with those actions that you want them to take as well, so there's no confusion. All right, so I also wanted to spend some time going into how Alteryx is building out our governance for helping us shift left. And so we don't have everything built out, of course, but this is just what we've been working on so far. So first, we have a definition for what we call a major incident. And so this is beyond our regular anomaly alerts. So this is something that's going to have an imminent impact to our whole budget. And so these are cost spikes that we want to address more timely, and we have more authority to escalate it up to leadership. So for detecting this, we have our own scripts, and once we get that alert, we send it out to the engineering teams. And this is where we're working on that process for how the engineering teams can best resolve the incident, but ultimately they are responsible for that part. And then once that's resolved, we've created a specific FinOps RCA template that we could go through. And this one is not for the FinOps team to figure out what we could have done better. It's for the engineers to figure out what was the actual action that they took that caused this incident so that they could better learn the impact of their decisions and hopefully shift that more left to them so that they're thinking about it on a daily basis. So next, we've also developed some observability. So again, this goes back to the FinOps tools and systems. So for us, we needed a process to be able to identify if any of our tools went down so that we could still be those good business partners to the business. And we also needed a communication strategy. So even if we were working on it on our side, we needed the engineers and other teams who look at our tools to be aware that there's an incident that we're resolving as well. And then lastly, this is ongoing, but we're trying to improve our best practices overall. And so in a way, this is kind of what FinOps teams do already, but if you reframe it from a risk perspective, we're trying to implement all of those controls or best practices to bring our risk level to an acceptable level for the business. And so that includes doing an inventory on which teams are doing which best practices, doing that gap analysis, and then also setting some budget baselines for them that go into some of our other policies. All right, so we are close to wrapping up, but I did want to give some thoughts around how to start conversations with different teams and also my thoughts on how this can enable engineers as you shift FinOps left. So first, I would say to figure out what you want to do for FinOps next and where you want to take your program, because there might already be a team out there that's doing something similar within your organization. They just might sit in a different department. And then I would also say that when you do a collaboration, you should think about how you can add value to that team as well. So for me and the security team, we were able to share our information and get value out of that. And then with me and the data science team, we were able to work on some new cool projects together that didn't exist before. Now for how this enables engineers, I mentioned those RCAs. So those at least get engineers involved and can help them start thinking about FinOps and the impacts, again, of those decisions that they make. And if teams are thinking about optimizing incrementally, then it'll keep their costs kind of in line with where we want them to be versus having it roll into a bigger problem that would interrupt their development work in the future. We want them to be able to optimize while keeping their current development velocity. All right, now lastly, there is a common analogy on the security side that relates governance to bowling with bumpers. And so I used to be a really bad bowler, and I think my highest score was like a 22, which if you know anything about bowling, that is really terrible. And so bumpers are there to help reduce the risk that the ball falls in the gutter. And they also keep the players focused on the end of the lane where the pins are, which is the goal. And so experts can come in, they don't need bumpers, they can bowl and hit all the pins at the end, and it's no problem. But I choose to use bumpers now so that I have a chance of being competitive and I can still have fun, and I don't have to learn how to be an expert. And when it comes to FinOps, the engineering teams are primarily engineers. They are not FinOps practitioners, and they might not want to be FinOps practitioners. So some of them might, but. So when we implement our governance, it's similar to allowing the teams to bowl with bumpers so that they can focus on those specific FinOps goals at the end of the lane that we're asking of them. And that way, they don't have to guess about where their responsibility starts and where the FinOps one ends. And so it prevents them from falling into the gutter potentially. And so I can call that one FinOps with bumpers potentially. I don't know. All right. Cool. So what is next for me? Well, there's many other teams out there that might be doing some cool things, so I'm always looking to learn from them. And I'm also working on my FinOps++ template, so that spreadsheet with some additional things from NIST, so I can share that out once that's done. And then finally, here are all of my references. So these are the main documents from NIST that I used, and some of them are really long, so I definitely recommend reading through at least a summary of them, because it gives a really good perspective to how organizations implement risk management overall. So, awesome. Thank you, everybody.
When identifying non-compliance, like, and you have the policies, what happens? Like, in your organization, obviously I saw some escalation issues, but I'm just very curious around, they're not complying, you have identified that this is a problem, how do you handle what's next?
Yeah, I think that goes back to setting it up for success in the first place, because if you just say that you're going to start tracking this thing and then you start tracking it tomorrow, they're not going to have time to actually implement that. And so I think before you can even get to that step of holding them accountable, they should know that if they don't do something, that you're going to come and check with them. So yeah, so I would say, if that happens, then you should follow the processes that you have documented to go reach out to them to resolve it, and they should feel comfortable in setting it up for you because you've gone through the first steps of getting them to that point. So. Yeah, at least at first, right? Like, you got to give them a chance.
Hey everyone, producer Andrew here. Thank you so much for watching and for your support. For more FinOps X 2025 content, go check out our YouTube channel. Like, subscribe, and leave comments and questions for all of our wonderful speakers. We appreciate your support.